to know some of the folks and to see me met again. Some of my folks that I've met previously from the Niagara Foundation and now to Turkish, the Cultural Center. It's really helpful for me to get to know people in the community and to come to understand all of the opportunities that are out here in the Madison area. A lot of these things, of course, kind of go underneath the radar sometimes. And so I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. What I want to do tonight is just, I don't really have any multimedia. That was a great video. I really, again, very nicely put together. Whoever made the video did a nice job. But what I want to share with you is, again, very informal way. I want to share some newspaper history, the history of some of the newspaper industry in this country, and then a very quick overview of my company. The Wisconsin State Journal is the newspaper that I work at, and we're a part of a larger newspaper chain called Lee Enterprises, which is a national chain, and I want to tell you just a little bit about that. Then I want to tell you sort of about how things are going at the State Journal and what we're doing now, and kind of our staff and that sort of thing, just kind of a quick snapshot of life at the Wisconsin State Journal. And then I want to talk at the end about our new digital world and all of our new technology and again, the evolving nature of our business, as you all know, I'm sure is really tracking into the digital area and the electronic mode like never before. So I want to share some of our highlights about that. And then again, time allowing, I really would like to have some nice question and answer time. I really want to answer any questions you might have about the State Journal particularly, or the newspaper business in general. Be happy to do what I could on that. If you would indulge me, I'm just going to read a couple of things here off some of my notes on this history portion. Particularly, there's a I don't know if you ever heard of it, but there's a database project out of Stanford University where they literally have cataloged all of the newspapers in the United States from the very beginning until today, essentially. And it's just a massive database that plots all around the country newspapers. And so I used that database as a little bit of background for establishing the history of the newspaper business in this country. In 1774, they listed 61 newspapers that existed in this country in 1774. None of them were daily papers, of course, at that point. And again, this is at the eve of the American Revolution that newspapers were published up and down the colonies. Toiling under the 1765 Stamp Act, the newspapers were required to pay heavy taxes on paper and advertisements. Some of them folded entirely, while others printed a skull and crossbones on their masthead, declaring themselves dead already. Boston was a home to both patriot newspapers like the pro-independence Boston Gazette and the loyalist Tory sheets, as they were called, the papers and the people that were still supporting England. That was in the mid-1770s. By the 1790s, there were 140 newspapers in the colonies. The first daily paper in the United States was the Philadelphia Evening Post, and they began publication in 1783. That was the first daily paper. And again, in that era, the move to a daily paper was much less about breaking news, which is, of course, what we're all about now, and our move into the digital world is all about up-to-the-minute now, real-time reporting. Well, back in those days, it was really about shipping news. The big thing that they covered was what was coming in and going out on the ships. But the papers in that era also were very strident in their political leanings. They were all very, again, partisan, I guess would be a good way to put that, in the early era. In 1801, Alexander Hamilton founded the New York Evening Post, which is a paper you probably have heard of or maybe seen lots of, which today is the longest living daily newspaper in the United States. It has, of course, evolved and changed, and no doubt Alexander Hamilton would not recognize the paper, the New York Evening Post today, because it is one of those flashy, tabloid-like, big screaming headlines, and it's a very brassy, very kind of a flamboyant type of newspaper. But it is the longest serving newspaper in the United States at the daily level. By 1900, believe it or not, by 1900 there were 15,872 newspapers in this country. And again, that began the era of the mass circulation dailies in New York. William Randolph Hearst's The New York Journal and The New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, were battling it out, and it was tooth and nail competition. Both papers became very flamboyant. A lot of big headlines, a lot of big color, a lot of very artistic graphics were used in the paper. term yellow journalism. If you've ever heard the term yellow journalism, it started in that era, and it spun out of a comic strip character in the comic Hogan's Alley, and there was the Hogan's Alley character was nicknamed the Yellow Kid, and that became kind of a shorthand definition for sensationalistic journalism and for going way over the top and for being kind of pushing out on the edges. It was known as yellow journalism. By 2000, fast forward to 2000, 100 years, there was 13,690 newspapers in the United States. So there were a couple thousand less papers in that 100-year era. Fast forward now to the middle 1990s, the advent again of the internet and the development of websites has had a pretty powerful effect on the industry, obviously. The newspapers were still considered some of the best sources for original reporting, but people suddenly could get news on the internet everywhere, and it has had a vast, significant effect, particularly on daily newspapers. There still are, at the last count as of 2011, there are 13,600 newspapers in the United States. But the vast majority of those are not daily newspapers. They are weeklies or monthly publications, something other than dailies. Talking about daily papers, of which the State Journal is a daily paper, of course, the numbers drop down, way down to today. There's about 1,300 or so, 1,350 daily papers in the United States. Again, people think, one of the things I wanted to talk about just briefly was there's a perception out there that the newspaper industry is sort of dying on the vine, and that papers are closing down left and right, and that there is a mad scramble, and that I often will ask people, if I had to ask you how many newspapers do you think have gone out of business in the last 10 years, let's say, people, if you say that if there's 1,300 or 1,400 newspapers in the country, daily papers, and how many dailies have gone out of business, people will say, maybe 400 or 500. Typically the guess of how many papers have closed is much, much higher than the reality of it. And the reality of it is that, again, in 1980, going back 32 years, there were 1,745 daily papers in the United States. Today, again, there's about 1,350. So certainly it's a decrease, but the number goes down. In 85, there was a decrease of 69 papers. In 1990, another 65. In 1995, 78 papers, and so on. So that it's a much smaller number than most people would think, because what has happened, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been some high-profile closings in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News, and several other metropolitan areas where there were more than one newspaper typically, and typically the afternoon paper was the one that closed down. There are not nearly as many cities anymore where there's both a morning paper and an afternoon paper, which, again, Madison is an example of that. We used to have a morning paper in the State Journal and an afternoon paper in the Capital Times. Well, the Capital Times is no longer a daily paper. They would be one of those on this list of papers that could no longer support the daily publication. So the Capital Times they publish 2 weekly sections, a Wednesday piece and a Thursday piece in print, and then they're online all the time. They're mostly an online newspaper at this point. So they're an example of that kind of changing nature of our business. The numbers in Wisconsin, there are 225 total newspapers in Wisconsin. It's estimated right now. 30 of those are daily newspapers, so there are 30 dailies and 175 weeklies around the state of Wisconsin. Again, the last Wisconsin newspaper to close was back in May of 2010, and there actually have been several small weekly papers that have started in the last 2 or 3 years. So the Wisconsin numbers are fairly stable, actually, and if anything, maybe up a little tick in the last 3 or 4 years from the historic numbers.